Section 4 of 3 Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. 3 Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous in opposition to skeptics and atheists by George Berkeley. Section 4. The Second Dialogue. Hyl, I beg your pardon, Philonous, for not meeting you sooner. All this morning my head was so filled with our late conversation that I had not leisure to think of the time of the day, or indeed of anything else. Philonous, I am glad you were so intent upon it, in hopes if there were any mistakes in your concessions, or fallacies in my reasonings from them, you will now discover them to me. Hyl, I assure you I have done nothing ever since I saw you, but search after mistakes and fallacies, and, with that view, have minutely examined the whole series of yesterday's discourse, but all in vain, for the notions it led me into, upon review, appear still more clear and evident, and, the more I consider them, the more irresistibly do they force my assent. Phil, it is not this, think you, a sign that they are genuine? That they proceed from nature, and are conformable to right reason? Truth and beauty are in this alike, that the strictest survey sets them both off to advantage, while the false lustre of error and disguise cannot endure being reviewed, or too nearly inspected. Hyl, I own there is a great deal in what you say, nor can anyone be more entirely satisfied of the truth of those odd consequences, so long as I have in view the reasonings that lead to them. But, when these are out of my thoughts, there seems, on the other hand, something so satisfactory, so natural and intelligible in the modern way of explaining things that, I profess, I know not how to reject it. Phil, I know not what way you mean. Hyl, I mean the way of accounting for our sensations or ideas. Phil, how is that? Hyl, it is supposed the soul makes her residence in some part of the brain, from which the nerves take their rise, and are thence extended to all parts of the body, and that outward objects, by the different impressions they make on the organs of sense, communicate certain vibrative motions to the nerves, and these being filled with spirits, propagate them to the brain or seat of the soul, which, according to the various impressions or traces thereby made in the brain, is variously affected with ideas. Phil, and call you this an explication of the manner whereby we are affected with ideas? Hyl, why not, Philonous? Have you anything to object against it? Phil, I would first know whether I rightly understand your hypothesis. You make certain traces in the brain to be the causes or occasions of our ideas. Pray tell me whether by the brain you mean any sensible thing. Hyl, what else think you I could mean? Phil, sensible things are all immediately perceivable, and those things which are immediately perceivable are ideas, and these exist only in the mind. Thus much you have, if I mistake not, long since agreed to. Hyl, I do not deny it. Phil, the brain therefore you speak of, being a sensible thing, exists only in the mind. Now, I would fain know whether you think it reasonable to suppose that one idea or thing existing in the mind occasions all other ideas. And, if you think so, pray how do you account for the origin of that primary idea, or brain itself? Hyl, I do not explain the origin of our ideas by that brain which is perceivable to sense, this being itself only a combination of sensible ideas, but by another which I imagine. Phil, but are not things imagined as truly in the mind as things perceived? Hyl, I must confess they are. Phil, it comes, therefore, to the same thing, and you have been all this while accounting for ideas by certain motions or impressions of the brain, that is, by some alterations in an idea, whether sensible or imaginable, it matters not. Hyl, I begin to suspect my hypothesis. Phil, besides spirits, all that we know or conceive are our own ideas. When, therefore, you say all ideas are occasioned by impressions in the brain, do you conceive this brain or no? If you do, then you talk of ideas imprinted in an idea causing that same idea, which is absurd. If you do not conceive it, you talk unintelligibly, instead of forming a reasonable hypothesis. Hyl, I now clearly see it was a mere dream. there is nothing in it. PHIL. You need not be much concerned at it. For after all, this way of explaining things, as you called it, could never have satisfied any reasonable man. What connexion is there between a motion in the nerves and the sensations of sound or colour in the mind? Or how is it possible these should be the effect of that? HYL. But I could never think it had so little in it as now it seems to have. PHIL. Well then, are you at length satisfied that no sensible things have a real existence, and that you are in truth an arrant sceptic? HYL. It is too plain to be denied. PHIL. Look, are not the fields covered with a delightful verdure? Is there not something in the woods and groves, in the rivers and clear springs, that soothes, that delights, that transports the soul? At the prospect of the wide and deep ocean, or some huge mountain whose top is lost in the clouds, or of an old gloomy forest, are not our minds filled with a pleasing horror? Even in rocks and deserts is there not an agreeable wildness? How sincere a pleasure is it to behold the natural beauties of the earth, to preserve and renew our relish for them! Is not the veil of night alternately drawn over her face, and doth she not change her dress with the seasons? How aptly are the elements disposed! What variety and use in the meanest productions of nature! What delicacy, what beauty, what contrivance, in animal and vegetable bodies! How exquisitely are all things suited, as well to their particular ends, as to constitute opposite parts of the whole! And, while they mutually aid and support, do they not also set off and illustrate each other? Raise now your thoughts from this ball of earth to all those glorious luminaries that adorn the high arch of heaven. The motion and situation of the planets, are they not admirable for use and order? Were those (miscalled erratic) globes once known to stray, in their repeated journeys through the pathless void? Do they not measure areas round the sun ever proportioned to the times? So fixed, so immutable are the laws by which the unseen Author of nature actuates the universe. How vivid and radiant is the lustre of the fixed stars! How magnificent and rich that negligent profusion with which they appear to be scattered throughout the whole azure vault! Yet, if you take the telescope, it brings into your sight a new host of stars that escape the naked eye. Here they seem contiguous and minute, but to a nearer view immense orbs of light at various distances, far sunk in the abyss of space. Now you must call imagination to your aid. The feeble narrow sense cannot descry innumerable worlds revolving around the central fires, and in those worlds the energy of an all-perfect mind displayed in endless forms. But neither sense nor imagination are big enough to comprehend the boundless extent, with all its glittering furniture. Though the labouring mind exert and strain each power to its utmost reach, there still stands out ungrasped a surplusage immeasurable. Yet all the vast bodies that compose this mighty frame, how distant and remote soever, are by some secret mechanism, some divine art and force, linked in a mutual dependence and intercourse with each other. Even with this earth, which was almost slipped from my thoughts and lost in the crowd of worlds. Is not the whole system immense, beautiful, glorious beyond expression and beyond thought? What treatment, then, do those philosophers deserve who would deprive these noble and delightful scenes of all reality? How should those principles be entertained that lead us to think all the visible beauty of the creation a false imaginary glare? To be plain, can you expect this scepticism of yours will not be thought extravagantly absurd by all men of sense? HYL. Other men may think as they please, but for your part you have nothing to reproach me with. My comfort is, you are as much a sceptic as I am. PHIL. There, Hylas, I must beg leave to differ from you. HYL. What? Have you all along agreed to the premises, and do you now deny the conclusion, and leave me to maintain those paradoxes by myself which you led me into? This surely is not fair. PHIL. I deny that I agreed with you in those notions that led to scepticism. You indeed said the reality of sensible things consisted in an absolute existence out of the minds of spirits, or distinct from their being perceived. And, pursuant to this notion of reality, you are obliged to deny sensible things any real existence. That is, according to your own definition, you profess yourself a sceptic. But I neither said nor thought the reality of sensible things was to be defined after that manner. To me it is evident, for the reasons you allow of, that sensible things cannot exist otherwise than in a mind or spirit. Whence I conclude, not that they have no real existence, but that, seeing they depend not on my thought, and have all existence distinct from being perceived by me, there must be some other mind wherein they exist. As sure, therefore, as the sensible world really exists, so sure is there an infinite, omnipresent Spirit who contains and supports it. HYL. What? This is no more than I and all Christians hold, nay, and all others who believe there is a God, and that He knows and comprehends all things. PHIL. Aye, but here lies the difference. Men commonly believe that all things are known or perceived by God, because they believe the being of a God, whereas I, on the other side, immediately and necessarily conclude the being of a God, because all sensible things must be perceived by Him. HYL. But so long as we all believe the same thing, what matter is it how we come by that belief? PHIL. But neither do we agree in the same opinion. For philosophers, though they acknowledge all corporeal beings to be perceived by God, yet they attribute to them an absolute subsistence distinct from their being perceived by any mind whatever, which I do not. Besides, is there no difference between saying, there is a God, therefore He perceives all things, and saying, sensible things do really exist, and, if they really exist, they are necessarily perceived by an infinite mind, therefore there is an infinite mind or God? This furnishes you with a direct and immediate demonstration, from a most evident principle, of the being of a God. Divines and philosophers had proved beyond all controversy, from the beauty and usefulness of the several parts of the creation, that it was the workmanship of God, but that, setting aside all help of astronomy and natural philosophy, all contemplation of the contrivance, order, and adjustment of things, an infinite mind should be necessarily inferred from the bare existence of the sensible world, is an advantage to them only who have made this easy reflection, that the sensible world is that which we perceive by our several senses, and that nothing is perceived by the senses beside ideas, and that no idea or archetype of an idea can exist otherwise than in a mind. You may now, without any laborious search into the sciences, without any subtlety of reason, or tedious length of discourse, oppose and baffle the most strenuous advocate for atheism. Those miserable refuges, whether in an internal succession of unthinking causes and effects, or in a fortuitous concourse of atoms, those wild imaginations of Vanini, Hobbes, and Spinoza, in a word, the whole system of atheism, is it not entirely overthrown by the single reflection on the repugnancy included in supposing the whole, or any part, even the most rude and shapeless of the visible world, to exist without a mind? Let any one of those abettors of impiety but look into his own thoughts, and there try if he can conceive how so much as a rock, a desert, a chaos, or a confused jumble of atoms, how anything at all, either sensible or imaginable, can exist independent of a mind, and he need go no farther to be convinced of his folly. Can anything be fairer than to put a dispute on such an issue, and leave it to a man himself to see if he can conceive, even in thought, what he holds to be true in fact, and from a notional to allow it a real existence? HYL. It cannot be denied there is something highly serviceable to religion in what you advance. But do you not think it looks very like a notion entertained by some eminent moderns, of seeing all things in God? PHIL. I would gladly know that opinion. Pray explain it to me. HYL. They conceive that the soul, being immaterial, is incapable of being united with material things, so as to perceive them in themselves, but that she perceives them by her union with the substance of God, which, being spiritual, is therefore purely intelligible, or capable of being the immediate object of a spirit's thought. Besides, the divine essence contains in it perfections correspondent to each created being, and which are, for that reason, proper to exhibit or represent them to the mind. PHIL. I do not understand how our ideas, which are things altogether passive and inert, can be the essence, or any part (or like any part) of the essence or substance of God, who is an impassive, indivisible, pure, active being. Many more difficulties and objections there are which occur at first view against this hypothesis, but I shall only add that it is liable to all the absurdities of the common hypothesis in making a created world exist otherwise than in the mind of a spirit. Besides all which it hath this peculiar to itself, that it makes that material world serve to no purpose. And, if it pass for a good argument against other hypotheses in the sciences, that they suppose nature, or the divine wisdom, to make something in vain, or do that by tedious roundabout methods which might have been performed in a much more easy and compendious way, what shall we think of that hypothesis which supposes the whole world made in vain? HYL. But what say you? Are not you too of opinion that we see all things in God? If I mistake not, what you advance comes near it. PHIL. Few men think, yet all have opinions. Hence men's opinions are superficial and confused. It is nothing strange that tenets which in themselves are ever so different should nevertheless be confounded with each other, by those who do not consider them attentively. I shall not therefore be surprised if some men imagine that I run into the enthusiasm of Malebranche, though in truth I am very remote from it. He builds on the most abstract general ideas, which I entirely disclaim. He asserts an absolute external world, which I deny. He maintains that we are deceived by our senses, and know not the real natures, or the true forms and figures of extended beings, of all which I hold the direct contrary. So that upon the whole there is no principles more fundamentally opposite than his and mine. It must be owned that I entirely agree with what the Holy Scripture saith, that in God we live and move and have our being. But that we see things in his essence, after the manner above set forth, I am far from believing. Take here in brief my meaning. It is evident that the things I perceive are my own ideas, and that no idea can exist unless it be in a mind. Nor is it less plain that these ideas or things by me perceived, either themselves or their archetypes, exist independently of my mind, since I know myself not to be their author, it being out of my power to determine at pleasure what particular ideas I shall be affected with upon opening my eyes or ears. They must therefore exist in some other mind, whose will it is they should be exhibited to me. The things, I say, immediately perceived are ideas or sensations, call them which you will. But how can any idea or sensation exist in, or be produced by, anything but a mind or spirit? This indeed is inconceivable, and to assert that which is inconceivable is to talk nonsense, is it not? HYL. Without doubt. PHIL. But, on the other hand, it is very conceivable that they should exist in and be produced by a spirit, since this is no more than I daily experience in myself. Inasmuch as I perceive numberless ideas, and, by an act of my will, can form a great variety of them, and raise them up in my imagination, though it must be confessed these creatures of the fancy are not altogether so distinct, so strong, vivid, and permanent, as those perceived by my senses, which latter are called red things. From all which I conclude, there is a mind which affects me every moment with all the sensible impressions I perceive, and, from the variety, order, and manner of these, I conclude the author of them to be wise, powerful, and good, beyond comprehension. Mark it well, I do not say, I see things by perceiving that which represents them in the intelligible substance of God. This I did not understand, but I say, the things by me perceived are known by the understanding, and produced by the will of an infinite Spirit. It is not all this most plain and evident? Is there any more in it, than what a little observation in our own minds, and that which passeth in them, not only enables us to conceive, but also obliges us to acknowledge? HYL. I think I understand you very clearly, and own the proof you give of a deity seems no less evident than it is surprising. But, allowing that God is the supreme and universal cause of all things, yet, may there not be still a third nature, besides spirits and ideas? May we not admit a subordinate and limited cause of our ideas? In a word, may there not for all that be matter? PHIL. How often must I inculcate the same thing? You allow the things immediately perceived by sense to exist nowhere without the mind. But there is nothing perceived by sense which is not perceived immediately. Therefore there is nothing sensible that exists without the mind. The matter, therefore, which you still insist on, is something intelligible, I suppose, something that may be discovered by reason, and not by sense. HYL. You are in the right. PHIL. Pray let me know what reasoning your belief of matter is grounded on, and what this matter is, in your present sense of it. HYL. I find myself affected with various ideas, whereof I know I am not the cause. Neither are they the cause of themselves, or of one another, or capable of subsisting by themselves, as being altogether inactive, fleeting, dependent beings. They have therefore some cause distinct from me and them, of which I pretend to know no more than that it is the cause of my ideas. This thing, whatever it be, I call matter. PHIL. Tell me, Hylas, hath every one a liberty to change the current proper signification attached to a common name in any language? For example, suppose a traveller should tell you that in a certain country men pass unhurt through the fire, and, upon explaining himself, you found he meant by the word fire that which others call water. Or, if he should assert that there are trees that walk upon two legs, meaning men by the term trees, would you think this reasonable? HYL. No, I should think it very absurd. Common custom is the standard of propriety in language, and for any man to affect speaking improperly is to pervert the use of speech, and can never serve to a better purpose than to protract and multiply disputes, where there is no difference in opinion. PHIL. And doth not matter, in the common current acceptation of the word, signify an extended, solid, movable, unthinking, inactive substance? HYL. It doth. PHIL. And hath it not been made evident that no such substance can possibly exist? And, though it should be allowed to exist, yet how can that which is inactive be a cause, or that which is unthinking be a cause of thought? You may, indeed, if you please, annex to the word matter a contrary meaning to what is vulgarly received, and tell me you understand by it an unextended, thinking, active being, which is the cause of our ideas. But what else is this than to play with words, and run into the very fault you just now condemned with so much reason? I do by no means find fault with your reasoning, in that you collect a cause from the phenomena. But I deny that the cause deducible by reason can properly be termed matter. HYL. There is indeed something in what you say, but I am afraid you do not thoroughly comprehend my meaning. I would by no means be thought to deny that God, or an infinite Spirit, is the supreme cause of all things. All I contend for is, that, subordinate to the supreme agent, there is a cause of a limited and inferior nature which concurs in the production of our ideas, not by any act of will or spiritual efficiency, but by that kind of action which belongs to matter, viz. Motion. PHIL. I find you are at every turn relapsing into your old exploded conceit, of a movable, and consequently an extended, substance, existing without the mind. What? Have you already forgotten you were convinced, or are you willing I should repeat what has been said on that head? In truth, this is not fair dealing in you. Still to suppose the being of that which you have so often acknowledged to have no being. But, not to insist further on what has been so largely handled, I ask whether all your ideas are not perfectly passive and inert, including nothing of action in them? HYL. They are. PHIL. And are sensible qualities anything else but ideas? HYL. How often have I acknowledged that they are not? PHIL. But is not motion a sensible quality? HYL. It is. PHIL. Consequently it is no action? HYL. I agree with you, and indeed it is very plain that when I stir my finger it remains passive, but my will which produced the motion is active. PHIL. Now I desire to know, in the first place, whether motion being allowed to be no action, you can conceive any action besides volition, and, in the second place, whether to say something and conceive nothing be not to talk nonsense, and lastly, whether, having considered the premises, you do not perceive that to suppose any efficient or active cause of our ideas, other than spirit, is highly absurd and unreasonable? HYL. I give up the point entirely. But, though matter may not be a cause, yet what hinders its being an instrument, subservient to the supreme agent in the production of our ideas? PHIL. An instrument, say you? Pray what may be the figure, springs, wheels, and motions of that instrument? HYL. Those I pretend to determine nothing of, both the substance and its qualities being entirely unknown to me. PHIL. What? You are then of opinion it is made up of unknown parts, that it hath unknown motions, and an unknown shape? HYL. I do not believe that it hath any figure or motion at all, being already convinced that no sensible qualities can exist in an unperceiving substance. PHIL. But what notion is it possible to frame of an instrument void of all sensible qualities, even extension itself? HYL. I do not pretend to have any notion of it. PHIL. And what reason have you to think this unknown, this inconceivable somewhat doth exist? Is it that you imagine God cannot act as well without it? Or that you find by experience the use of some such thing, when you form ideas in your own mind? HYL. You are always teasing me for reasons of my belief. Pray, what reasons have you not to believe it? PHIL. It is to me a sufficient reason not to believe the existence of anything, if I see no reason for believing it. But, not to insist on reasons for believing, you will not so much as let me know what it is you would have me believe, since you say you have no manner of notion of it. After all, let me entreat you to consider whether it be like a philosopher, or even like a man of common sense, to pretend to believe you know not what and you know not why. HYL. Hold, Philonous. When I tell you matter is an instrument, I do not mean altogether nothing. It is true I know not the particular kind of instrument, but, however, I have some notion of instrument in general, which I apply to it. PHIL. But what if it should prove that there is something, even in the most general notion of instrument, as taken in a distinct sense from cause, which makes the use of it inconsistent with the divine attributes? HYL. Make that appear, and I shall give up the point. PHIL. What mean you by general nature or notion of instrument? HYL. That which is common to all particular instruments composeth the general notion. PHIL. Is it not common to all instruments that they are applied to the doing those things only which cannot be performed by the mere act of our wills? Thus, for instance, I never use an instrument to move my finger, because it is done by a volition. But I should use one if I were to remove part of a rock, or tear up a tree by the roots. Are you of the same mind, or can you show me any example where an instrument is made use of in producing an effect immediately depending on the will of the agent? HYL. I own I cannot. PHIL. How therefore can you suppose that an all-perfect Spirit, on whose will all things have an absolute and immediate dependence, should need an instrument in this operation, or, not needing it, make use of it? Thus it seems to me that you are obliged to own the use of a lifeless inactive instrument to be incompatible with the infinite perfection of God. That is, by your own confession, to give up the point. HYL. It doth not readily occur what I can answer you. PHIL. But, methinks, you should be ready to own the truth, when it has been fairly proved to you. We indeed, who are beings of finite powers, are forced to make use of instruments. And the use of an instrument showeth the agent to be limited by rules of another's prescription, and that he cannot obtain his ends but in such a way, and by such conditions. Whence it seems a clear consequence that the supreme unlimited agent useth no tool or instrument at all. The will of an omnipotent Spirit is no sooner exerted than executed, without the application of means, which, if they are employed by inferior agents, it is not upon account of any real efficacy that is in them, or necessary aptitude to produce any effect, but merely in compliance with the laws of nature, or those conditions prescribed to them by the first cause, who is himself above all imitation or prescription whatsoever. HYL. I will no longer maintain that matter is an instrument. However, I would not be understood to give up its existence neither, since, notwithstanding what hath been said, it may still be an occasion. PHIL. How many shapes is your matter to take? or how often must it be proved not to exist, before you are content to part with it? But, to say no more of this, (though by all the laws of disputation I may justly blame you for so frequently changing the signification of the principal term), I would fain know what you mean by affirming that Matter is an occasion, having already denied it to be a cause. And, when you have shown in what sense you understand occasion, pray, in the next place, be pleased to shew me what reason induceth you to believe there is such an occasion of our ideas. HYL. As to the first point, by occasion I mean an inactive unthinking being, at the presence whereof God excites ideas in our minds. PHIL. And what may be the nature of that inactive unthinking being? HYL. I know nothing of its nature. PHIL. Proceed then to the second point, and assign some reason why we should allow an existence to this inactive, unthinking, unknown thing. HYL. When we see ideas produced in our minds, after an orderly and constant manner, it is natural to think they have some fixed and regular occasions, at the presence of which they are excited. PHIL. You acknowledge then God alone to be the cause of our ideas, and that He causes them at the presence of those occasions. HYL. That is my opinion. PHIL. Those things which you say are present to God, without doubt He perceives? HYL. Certainly, otherwise they could not be to Him an occasion of acting. PHIL. Not to insist now on your making sense of this hypothesis, or answering all the puzzling questions and difficulties it is liable to, I only ask whether the order and regularity observable in the series of our ideas, or the course of nature, be not sufficiently accounted for by the wisdom and power of God, and whether it doth not derogate from those attributes to suppose He is influenced, directed, or put in mind, when and what He is to act, by an unthinking substance? And lastly, whether, in case I granted all you contended for, it would make anything to your purpose, it not being easy to conceive how the external or absolute existence of an unthinking substance, distinct from its being perceived, can be inferred from my allowing that there are certain things perceived by the mind of God, which are to Him the occasion of producing ideas in us? HYL. I am perfectly at a loss what to think, this notion of occasion seeming now altogether as groundless as the rest. PHIL. Do you not at length perceive that in all these different acceptations of Matter, you have been only supposing you know not what, for no manner of reason, and to no kind of use? HYL. I freely own myself less fond of my notions, since they have been so accurately examined. But still, methinks, I have some confused perception, that there is such a thing as Matter. PHIL. Either you perceive the being of Matter immediately or mediately. If immediately, pray inform me by which of the senses you perceive it. If mediately, let me know by what reasoning it is inferred from those things which you perceive immediately. So much for the perception. Then for the Matter itself, I ask whether it is object, substratum, cause, instrument, or occasion. You have already pleaded for each of these, shifting your notions and making Matter to appear sometimes in one shape, then in another, and what you have offered hath been disapproved and rejected by yourself. If you have anything new to advance, I would gladly bear it. HYL. I think I have already offered all I had to say on those heads. I am at a loss what more to urge. PHIL. And yet you are loath to part with your old prejudice. But, to make you quit it more easily, I desire that, beside what has been hitherto suggested, you will farther consider whether, upon supposition that Matter exists, you can possibly conceive how you should be affected by it; or, supposing it did not exist, whether it be not evident you might for all that be affected with the same ideas you now are, and consequently you have the very same reasons to believe its existence that you now can have. HYL. I acknowledge it is possible we might perceive all things just as we do now, though there was no Matter in the world. Neither can I conceive, if there be Matter, how it should produce any idea in our minds. And I do farther grant you have entirely satisfied me that it is impossible there should be such a thing as Matter in any of the foregoing acceptations. But still I cannot help supposing that there is Matter in some sense or other. What that is, I do not indeed pretend to determine. PHIL. I do not expect you should define exactly the nature of that unknown being. Only be pleased to tell me whether it is a substance, and if so, whether you can suppose a substance without accidents, or, in case you suppose it to have accidents or qualities, I desire you will let me know what those qualities are, at least what is meant by matter supporting them. HYL. We have already argued on those points. I have no more to say to them. But, to prevent any further questions, let me tell you I at present understand by matter neither substance nor accident, thinking nor extended being, neither cause, instrument, nor occasion, but something entirely unknown, distinct from all these. PHIL. It seems then you include in your present notion of matter nothing but the general abstract idea of entity. HYL. Nothing else, save only that I superadd to this general idea the negation of all those particular things, qualities, or ideas that I perceive, imagine, or in any wise apprehend. PHIL. Pray, where do you suppose this unknown matter to exist? HYL. O Philonous, now you think you have entangled me, for, if I say it exists in place, then you will infer that it exists in the mind, since it is agreed that place or extension exists only in the mind. But I am not ashamed to my own ignorance. I know not where it exists, only I am sure it exists not in place. There is a negative answer for you, and you must expect no other to all the questions you put for the future about matter. PHIL. Since you will not tell me where it exists, be pleased to inform me after what manner you suppose it to exist, or what you mean by its existence. HYL. It neither thinks nor acts, neither perceives nor is perceived. PHIL. But what is there positive in your abstracted notion of its existence? HYL. Upon a nice observation, I do not find I have any positive notion or meaning at all. I tell you again, I am not ashamed to own my ignorance. I know not what is meant by its existence, or how it exists. PHIL. Continue, good Hylas, to act the same ingenuous part, and tell me sincerely whether you can frame a distinct idea of entity in general, prescinded from and exclusive of all thinking and corporeal beings, all particular things whatsoever. HYL. Hold, let me think a little. I profess, Philonous, I do not find that I can. At first glance, methought I had some dilute and airy notion of pure entity in abstract, but upon closer attention it hath quite vanished out of sight. The more I think on it, the more am I confirmed in my prudent resolution of giving none but negative answers, and not pretending to the least degree of any positive knowledge or conception of matter, its where, its how, its entity, or anything belonging to it. PHIL. When, therefore, you speak of the existence of matter, you have not any notion in your mind? HYL. None at all. PHIL. Pray tell me if the case stands not thus. At first, from a belief of material substance, you would have it that the immediate objects existed without the mind. Then, that they are archetypes. Then, causes. Next, instruments. Then, occasions. Lastly, something in general, which being interpreted proves nothing. So matter comes to nothing. What think you, Hylas? Is not this a fair summary of your whole proceeding? HYL. Be that as it will, yet I still insist upon it, that our not being able to conceive a thing is no argument against its existence. PHIL. That from a cause, effect, operation, sign, or other circumstance, there may reasonably be inferred the existence of a thing not immediately perceived, and that it were absurd for any man to argue against the existence of that thing, from his having no direct and positive notion of it, I freely own. But, where there is nothing of all this, where neither reason nor revelation induces us to believe the existence of a thing, where we have not even a relative notion of it, where an abstraction is made from perceiving and being perceived, from spirit and idea, lastly, where there is not so much as the most inadequate or faint idea pretended to, I will not indeed thence conclude against the reality of any notion, or existence of anything, but my inference shall be, that you mean nothing at all, that you employ words to no manner of purpose, without any design or signification whatsoever, and I leave it to you to consider how mere jargon should be treated. HYL. To deal frankly with you, Philonous, your arguments seem in themselves unanswerable, but they have not so great an effect on me as to produce that entire conviction, that hearty acquiescence which attends demonstration. I find myself relapsing into an obscure surmise of I know not what, matter. PHIL. But are you not sensible, Hylas, that two things must concur to take away all scruple, and work a plenary assent in the mind? Let a visible object be set in never so clear a light, yet if there is any imperfection in the sight, or if the eye is not directed towards it, it will not be distinctly seen. And though a demonstration be never so well grounded and fairly proposed, yet, if there is withal a stain of prejudice, or a wrong bias on the understanding, can it be expected on a sudden to perceive clearly and adhere firmly to the truth? No, there is need of time and pains. The attention must be awakened and detained by a frequent repetition of the same thing placed oft in the same, oft in different lights. I have said it already, and find I must still repeat and inculcate, that it is an unaccountable licence you take, in pretending to maintain you know not what, for you know not what reason, to you know not what purpose. Can this be paralleled in any art or science, any sect or profession of men? Or is there anything so barefacedly groundless and unreasonable to be met with even in the lowest of common conversation? But, perhaps you will still say, matter may exist, though at the same time you neither know what is meant by matter, or by its existence. This indeed is surprising, and the more so, because it is altogether voluntary and of your own head, you not being led to it by any one reason. For I challenge you to show me that thing in nature which needs matter to explain or account for it. HYL. The reality of things cannot be maintained without supposing the existence of matter. It is not this, think you, a good reason why I should be earnest in its defence? PHIL. The reality of things? What things? Sensible or intelligible? HYL. Sensible things. PHIL. My glove, for example? HYL. That, or any other thing perceived by the senses. PHIL. But to fix on some particular thing, is it not a sufficient evidence to me of the existence of this glove, that I see it, and feel it, and wear it? Or, if this will not do, how is it possible I should be assured of the reality of this thing, which I actually see in this place, by supposing that some unknown thing, which I never did or can see, exists after an unknown manner, in an unknown place, or in no place at all? How can the supposed reality of that which is intangible be a proof that anything tangible really exists? Or of that which is invisible, that any visible thing? Or, in general, of anything which is imperceptible, that a perceptible exists? Do but explain this, and I shall think nothing too hard for you. HYL. Upon the whole, I am content to own the existence of matter is highly improbable, but the direct and absolute impossibility of it does not appear to me. PHIL. But granting matter to be possible, yet, upon that account merely, it can have no more claim to existence than a golden mountain, or a centaur. HYL. I acknowledge it, but still you do not deny it is possible, and that which is possible, for aught you know, may actually exist. PHIL. I deny it to be possible, and have, if I mistake not, evidently proved, from your own concessions, that it is not. In the common sense of the word, matter, is there any more implied than an extended, solid, figured, movable substance, existing without the mind? And have not you acknowledged, over and over, that you have seen evident reason for denying the possibility of such a substance? HYL. True, but that is only one sense of the term matter. PHIL. But is it not the only proper, genuine, received sense? And if matter, in such a sense, be proved impossible, may it not be thought, with good grounds, absolutely impossible? Else how could anything be proved impossible? Or indeed, how could there be any proof, at all one way or the other, to a man who takes the liberty to unsettle and change the common signification of words? HYL. I thought philosophers might be allowed to speak more accurately than the vulgar, and were not always confined to the common acceptation of a term. PHIL. But this now mentioned is the common received sense among philosophers themselves. But, not to insist on that, have you not been allowed to take matter in what sense you pleased? And have you not used this privilege in the utmost extent, sometimes entirely changing, at others leaving out, or putting into the definition of it whatever, for the present, best served your design, contrary to all the known rules of reason and logic? And hath not this shifting, unfair method of yours spun out our dispute to an unnecessary length, matter having been particularly examined, and by your own confession refuted in each of those senses? And can any more be required to prove the absolute impossibility of a thing, than the proving it impossible in every particular sense that either you or anyone else understands it in? HYL. But I am not so thoroughly satisfied that you have proved the impossibility of matter in the last most obscure, abstracted, and indefinite sense. PHIL. When is a thing shown to be impossible? HYL. When a repugnancy is demonstrated between the ideas comprehended in its definition. PHIL. But where there are no ideas, there no repugnancy can be demonstrated between ideas? HYL. I agree with you. PHIL. Now, in that which you call the obscure, indefinite sense of the word matter, it is plain, by your own confession, there was included no idea at all. No sense except an unknown sense, which is the same thing as none. You are not, therefore, to expect I should prove a repugnancy between ideas, where there are no ideas, or the impossibility of matter taken in an unknown sense, that is, no sense at all. My business was only to show you meant nothing, and this you were brought to own. So that, in all your various senses, you have been showed either to mean nothing at all, or, if anything, an absurdity. And, if this be not sufficient to prove the impossibility of a thing, I desire you will let me know what is. HYL. I acknowledge you have proved that matter is impossible, nor do I see what more can be said in defence of it. But, at the same time that I give up this, I suspect all my other notions, for surely none could be more seemingly evident than this once was, and yet it now seems as false and absurd as ever it did true before. But I think we have discussed the point sufficiently for the present. The remaining part of the day I would willingly spend in running over in my thoughts the several heads of this morning's conversation, and tomorrow shall be glad to meet you here again about the same time. PHIL. I will not fail to attend you. End of section 4, and end of the second dialogue. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards.